Hi, this is the Evolution Lab podcast, and I'm Matt Roberts. This is part of my ongoing mission to keep developing the optimum way to help people reach their goals, overcome adversity, and change perceptions about what's possible to achieve with our bodies. The Evolution Lab is all about being the very best version of you. Please make sure you like, subscribe, and follow the podcast, and make sure you leave a rating and review. It'll help others to find the podcast to share and enjoy too. And now, let's get into the show. My guest on today's Evolution Lab podcast is Dr. Tamsin Lewis. Dr. Tamsin is qualified with honours from King's College London and Guy's St Thomas Hospital. She has a BSc in neuroscience and biology of aging and specialist training in psychiatry and sports medicine with further education in nutritional and functional medicine. Tam's also, just to blow her trumpet here, a member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and trustee of the British Society for Lifestyle Medicine. Tam's background as well is an elite triathlete, so great sort of experience in the fully competitive sporting world. And more recently, Tam's more interested as well in researching the therapeutic use of psychedelic compounds. Definitely coming back on that one later on for sure. Tam, how are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you. I'm still out in sunny, windy Ibiza for another few weeks before returning with a bump to London.
So look, we're here today to talk about longevity. That's your specialist area. You've got a company called Wellgevity, which the clues in the name all about wellness and longevity to ensure we can achieve great things for as long as possible. This whole area of longevity, the amount of investment into research that's gone in the last, 5, 8, 10 years. There's a rumor that even Jeff Bezos is spending about $1 billion on finding the answer to live forever. So who knows? There may be in all sorts of places. And the quest is all about, can you live as a body for 1,000 years or however long it might be? And yet just last year, a report came out that I saw, you'll know this one, I'm sure, that said that there could be a maximum duration we live for of 150 years. So are we spending a huge amount of money looking for this live forever answer, when in reality, the human body can only cope with so much, is one question. The next one actually alongside that, which we can answer all together, is are we creating a gap between the rich and the poor on longevity by the investment at the higher end, which then won't filter down to the lower end of the mass populations?
Yeah, lots of key questions there, hey. But there's definitely been an explosion in research and interest in longevity and whatever that is. By which, as you said, is led by some of these entrepreneurs that are living this lifestyle where they're like, okay, so we've got all this money at our disposal. How do we really create a long life? But the question is not really how we should be creating a long life, but how we create what we call health span, right? The number of years that we can live with relative health, not just decrepitude.
Decrepitude, that's a really good term.
I actually don't know where I got it from, but it's one that has stuck with me because it kind of embodies a lot of the fears that I have and some of which I began to experience with long COVID myself, which we can talk about later. But longevity, yes. I mean, this whole idea that we can, throw in a few supplements and a few metformin-like medications and create longevity, I think is nonsense. And we can come back to why, but I think the idea that we can live to 1,000 is not something that we're going to see in the next 50 years, for sure. The bodies that we have as is, for sure, there is a limit. 150 is probably pushing the limit, for sure. But I think, the concept of how do we extend our lifespan? How do we extend our health span? And what does that actually mean for the average person? Then what does it mean for research and for the people that can afford it in terms of looking at stem cell manipulation, even organ transplants, right? Some of the companies like the one run by Jim Mellon and Juvenescence are looking at replacing part of the thymus gland, which is one of our key immune system drivers, and that shrinks as we get older, and that's related to risk of cancer and risk of other things that are associated with accelerated aging and then clearly death. Because we don't die because we get old, we die because as we get older we accumulate damage, we accumulate cell damage that then becomes a disease of sorts, which then ends up contributing to our decline.
So just looking at that factor then, so describe then, if we go through the way in which that actually happens there, because our cells our capsule of our cell has to be protected. So that reproduction of that cell again and again via our DNA reproduction and via the signals that are given off by our chromosomes to do that. Protecting the cell is the key thing. And we need to produce enough trauma and threat to the body, to the cell, to make sure that it has a need to recreate. But where does it go wrong, and why does it go wrong? Which are the things that stop it recreating as the perfect cell again? Because if we had perfect cells each time, in theory, then we wouldn't age one bit. Where does it happen to go wrong?
I think you're talking about this concept of DNA dysfunction, which is accumulated cell damage over time, and there's multiple factors within the cell that control the DNA replication each time. So, I mean, it's a tricky one to answer because I think what you're trying to get at is that sometimes if we facilitate cellular clear out, which is something called cellular senescence, then we can basically keep more healthy cells and less of the damaged cells. And that is what things like fasting, intermittent fasting, ketosis, taking certain supplements or medications that stimulate what we call the sirtuin pathways, they effectively help clean out the bad stuff and keep our healthy cells going. So that is one whole area that is attracting a lot of interest. This whole concept of, getting rid of the damaged cells and then allowing our healthier cells to replicate as normal. But we know that DNA, every time our cells replicate, they repair. Sometimes there's deletions, there's damage in that system. And that is what cellular therapies like exosome therapies, etc., as was looking at in the research, is looking at trying to prevent that DNA damage that occurs as we age when cells replicate. And you've probably heard a little bit about stem cells, that people are taking their own stem cells, growing them in a lab, and then reinfusing it. Because stem cells contain growth factors, they can help repair healthy tissue. So they're all very interesting areas, but still completely out of reach of most people at the moment, and many it's in the research lab only currently. But not to say it won't be with us within a few years.
So stem cell therapy used for the anti-aging effect. I mean, stem cell therapy has been looked at for doing work on damaged tissues, for example, on tendons and ligaments, so on. But stem cell work for longevity, how does that work? At this point in time, how effective would that be? Someone taking that right now, doing that process right now, is that a case of it might make you live for another year, or is it 5? Is there a number on that yet, or is it too soon to say?
Okay, so it depends on the individual, because stem cells will go to and can be signaled to a site of damage within the body. So it really depends on how much damage you have in the body already and how much repair is needed. So, for example, if we were to inject stem cells directly into a joint or a ligament, as you say, or a tendon injury, then it's going to have a local reaction to repair that. But we haven't got to the point where we can confidently say, right, I'm going to take your stem cells from your fat, which is what's happening in the research, then grow them, harvest them, which means extend the mass of them, how many there are, and then purify it and then inject it back into you with enough of the signal to go and repair all the damaged tissue. So at the moment, this whole area is very much a personalized approach, because your level of damage maybe is not mine, right? Mine might be in my lung from COVID and yours might be in a damaged tendon, or, it's like what really causes aging. And we know it's cardiovascular aging. We know that it's brain aging. We know that it's tendon, joint, cartilage aging. So we almost we need a systems approach here. So, I don't know how this is I think the way that we're going to go in the future is potentially, banking our own stem cells, banking our own youthful tissue, and then sort of implanting it throughout our body as we get older. And that then
on a localized basis,
but you then need to give it these signals to do the right thing in the body, right? So it needs the right hormonal signal, for example, or it needs the right nutrient or vitamin to stimulate so that the context, the environment that these new cells are in is enabling the right thing.
In doing that approach of trying to get that to be enabled, having the right supplementation, what kind of things would that be? Is that around the NAD stuff, or is that around NMN? Is that a different pathway entirely? Which things would be the stimulators to make that happen? And do those things work without the stem cell therapy as well? So taking those supplementations that might be the orchestrators, are they going to work anyway without that? Are there things you can take that would do the same impact or not?
I think as you know from your own work and background, you know that the body works as a sort of systems operating system, as an operating system. It doesn't just work as a sum of isolated parts. And so this whole concept of can I take NMN and live longer, and NMN and NAD being what we call mitochondrial. So the mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell, everyone says, so it creates energy. And that needs, so it takes in food substrates, carbohydrate, protein, fat, the breakdowns of which, and then through a process within the cell creates energy. That process within the cell is dependent on things like NAD. If we take it orally, so NAD levels deplete with age, they deplete with chronic stress, they deplete with chronic illness, they deplete with chronic exposure to pollution. If you take NAD orally, it gets degraded in the stomach and doesn't get to where you need it. So a big part of this is how do we get things like NAD to where we need it? How do we actually get it into the cell? So the research shifted to
Let's just go through what NAD is as well quick. So NAD is a substrate of vitamin B12, is that correct?
No, NAD is, I can never pronounce it right, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. So it is it is created for a number of mechanisms, but if you take certain B vitamins, of which NMN is one, NMN is nicotinamide mononucleotide, I think, and that can be derived from nicotinamide, which is a type of a B vitamin, B3. Yeah. So we know that if you take NMN and other cofactors, so nothing works in isolation, right? That's why companies now who are looking at supplementation and improving NAD levels, that's a takeaway. Aging is associated with a decrease in NAD levels. How do we get NAD levels up? We can look at lifestyle measures that we can come to, but supplementation-wise, you can look at taking NAD precursors, which are things like NMN, alpha-lipoic acid, catechins like green tea extract. There's a supplement called Nuchido that a very smart Liverpudlian girl, Nicola, put together and has recently been on Bulletproof with. I mean, they've shown with that supplement to improve NAD levels. You can have a significant boost in NAD levels by taking it intravenously, although sourcing is expensive. It's a very expensive process and we don't know how long it lasts for. But yes, that whole area of NAD research is certainly one. I take a liquid NMN plus. So I use something by Quicksilver, which is like a liposomal form of NMN plus some other cofactors involved in NAD production.
Because the liposomal delivery gives it more chance of being absorbed correctly by the body, that's right?
Yeah, because it's with anything that goes into the stomach, it's at the mercy of the gastric enzymes, which then kind of break it all apart and it goes, so if you can get it through what we call the mucous membranes of the mouth, that means you can get it into the blood a lot quicker and it can go where it wants to.
Yeah, and with that in mind, actually, in terms of where it's delivered into, if it's going into the gut, I mean, your gut profile anyway, your microbiome clearly is part of the way in which our body can be higher immunity, and presumably that's part of the process of being able to extend longevity as well. I was chatting to Tim Spector some weeks ago, and his point was very much about, you know Tim very well, it's about having that huge array of diversity in a diet program to make sure there's enough of the right microbe activity within a gut, existence within a gut, to ensure there's a balance of absorption, digestion, and general body function. And without that, hard to function, hard to fight off things like COVID. His facts on actually the numbers of people who were suffering with COVID, who had poor microbiomes, was a vast difference in terms of how much people suffered, of course. So I guess the gut is key for longevity too, right?
Yes, and there's an explosion of research thanks to Tim and his team and his new project, Zoe. I think what this whole concept of, what you eat is not, you don't absorb food the way I absorb food. It's like that that burger, the sitting there is not going to be utilized by your body like it is by mine, simply because the digestive process is dependent on, as you say, the composition of microbiota, which are bugs essentially, not just bacteria, but viruses and yeasts and parasites. Some of these have cohabited with us for a long, long time. And what we know now, we're learning a lot about the microbiome, because people are like, well, what probiotics should I take? And I said, there's so much more to gut health than probiotics, because, sometimes they don't even stick in the gut. It's all about feeding up the good stuff in the gut. And then the good army can kill off some of the nasty stuff. And then we come into a bit more equilibrium. So this whole idea of feeding our microbiome is super interesting, but diversity is key. Diversity, not just of the diet, but also which encourages then a diversity of the ecosystem in our gut. And we don't do that anymore, because, our lives have become so, constrained compared to what we used to. We have we like ease. So we go and eat our same Pret lunch, and we have our same coffee, and we have our same thing every day, same dinner, because it's convenient. But ancestrally, we were not.
And our food's also much more sterile too. Our food is much more sterile than it used to be before. So our need to get in foods that are live foods has become less available on a day-to-day basis. Okay, diversity gives you part of that, but everything's been, whatever, not just pasteurized, but being kind of treated to death with whatever to make sure it has a long shelf life. Then you're taking away that ability to create more diversity. So we don't eat unpasteurized cheese. We don't have yogurt that's kind of as live as maybe it might have been years ago. So we're missing out on part of diet for the convenience factor of foods being on a shelf or in a fridge for a long period of time too, isn't it?
No, it's absolutely outstanding. That you can have a loaf of bread that nothing gets mold on it anymore. These things last forever, because they've then got preservatives in them that not just kill off the good healthy bacteria, but also, are also potentially damaging to our microbiome because they're chemicals. So we definitely.
So those foods are contributing towards our ability to not live for longer. So having these, the processed foods clearly are a large part of that, affecting our gut biology and therefore affecting our ability to live for more time, and not just live for longer, but this whole point coming back again on how we age and what we do functionally when we're older. I think it's David Sinclair had said that the ambition should always be that we're going to live to 100 and whatever, 20 or 30 or 40 years old, but to be playing tennis when we're in our 90s and do it in a really good, high functioning capacity. So this process of feeding your body, getting your gut to function well is part of that, isn't it? To make sure you feel energized and have purpose and usefulness.
Absolutely. And I agree, but it's very difficult to do within the lives that we have created ourselves, living in a city, living busy lives. So it requires an attitudinal shift, an economical shift, and a political shift in order to really help this happen. Otherwise, we're just going to get sicker, we're going to get chronically sicker and sicker. And the whole idea of throwing in some NMN to fix that, it's not going to work. So, it's a massive public health problem. And I think COVID has just brought this to the fore, how metabolically unhealthy we actually are. And some of Tim's research looking at the paucity of diversity in the gut being associated with not just COVID severity, but long COVID and gut inflammation. And gut inflammation is more than just what you eat. It's related to stress. It's related to consumption of chemicals and alcohol and, all sorts of things, and pollution. So it's really teasing all these things apart, looking at the macro of how you live your life and how can you get a better way of life on a day-to-day, because that's what really matters, not checking into an expensive resort twice a year. Look at the macro.
So that's that. Well, that's probably the next question then, is if someone is having this thought in mind, I can listen to the information about all the nuanced bits about how the body works and function, what the gut does, but what do I do? My job is in the center of a city. I live in an apartment in the center. If that's the person, that's your life. How does that person think, what can I do on a day-to-day basis to make even small step changes? So there's a whole load of anecdotal and researched evidence about anything from taking cold showers to drinking lemon water to you name it. There's also stuff there. Which is the easiest way to start someone's process? We know the effects of exercise are positive towards longevity. Of course, we know that. We know the effects of sleeping well help longevity and energy. But what does someone do to try and make some step changes? Probably starting with diet changes first? How does someone try and change their diet in basic ways to improve their chances of having a slow aging process or a longer life?
Yeah, all really valid questions. I think what you do, like your day, getting a good daily routine is good. And I think what you do 80% of the time matters. And what you do the other 20% of the time, the body, if you build a resilient one, will be able to cope with it. So I think for people, one of the simplest ways, and this is why the success of certain diets around this same process and protocol have been so helpful, is intermittent fasting, right? So eating all your food within an 8-hour window is something to be aimed for, so that your gut microbiome has time to clean itself, reset overnight, so that you don't encourage insulin production overnight, so that you maintain what we call insulin sensitivity. So intermittent fasting is definitely one. Not breaking a fast or not breaking an overnight fast with a high carbohydrate meal, because that will immediately shoot insulin levels up. And then you'll feel tired and sluggish and you'll crave more carbohydrate afterwards. So it's really encouraging breaking a fast with protein and some fats and other things that encourage longevity, with like high polyphenol foods like blueberries and seeds and nuts and certain oils, choline, all of those things are really good. So I think those things that, thinking about that from that is from a diet perspective for sure. Time restricted feeding.
Is that a case of having then just eating at the start and end of that window and nothing in between, having that period of just having no snacking? It's an area that's a little bit confusing. I know that Tim Spector said that was the way to try and go. I think Peter Thiel as well has the same idea in mind. And I know that University of Wisconsin had a report out 6 months ago that said that eating once per day was the ideal way to try and extend your longevity. But of course, for everyone, that's just impossible. And if you're active in particular, you just couldn't consume the calories you'd need to in that period of time. So is it 8 hours of eating window, 16 of not, and in the 8 hours eating at the start and the finish of that and nothing in between? Or is it snacking's okay and you just spread your calories in the 8 hours? Which is the best way to go about it?
I think mix up these things. I liked when Peter did this little Instagram video saying 3 concepts, right? The concept of CR, calorie restriction, TR, time restricted feeding, and DR, so that's caloric restriction, time restricted feeding, or dietary restriction. He said on any one day, pull one of those levers, one of the 3. So if you're having a day where you're time restricted feeding, you're eating everything within 8 hours, it's not being binary about eating at the start and the finish. It's just having 2 decent meals within that time window. And if you need one in the middle, that's fine. But then having an 8 hour, the other 16 hours in the day when you're not eating, you're not digesting, you're not consuming. So that's important. Or dietary restriction, it could be that you're not time restricted feeding, you're eating throughout the day, but dietary restriction would be, say, keto. So you're avoiding carbohydrate. So then you're in training what we call metabolic flexibility. So time restricted feeding, dietary restrictions, so going maybe low carb for a day, and then also looking at caloric restriction. So that could be you're eating throughout the day, but you're not eating very much, right? So your total calories might be less than 2,000, for example. So that is a really interesting approach to longevity long term, pulling one of 3 levers most of the time, every day.
You mentioned keto in there as well. So keto eating. So I know with Jim Mellon and Juvenescence, that's one of their mainstays, is getting into that ketogenic state and to eat a keto diet alongside that. Of course, for lots of people, what can sound quite a tempting thing, because it's a high-fat diet, it's low carbohydrate, it's somewhat limited proteins. So on the face of it, that's a tasty-sounding, way to live your life and have these amazing fatty foods. The practicality of that for most people is quite difficult. Do you think that the approach of doing a keto eating diet, in fact, well, first of all, the first question for everyone listening would be, what's the ratio, the macros of keto eating? Is 70% fats? Is that right? What's the breakdown?
Again, it very much depends on the individual, how quickly you go into ketosis, right? So ketosis is the process of how well your body breaks down fat, not just fat from that you've consumed, but fat from your body tissues to produce ketone bodies in the blood, which are then used as an alternative to glucose for fuel. So if you are what we call keto adapted, if you've been on a higher fat, lower carbohydrate diet, then you will go into ketosis, the ability to burn ketones more readily. So again, it's a personalized approach. Some people, if you're active, you can have 100 grams of carbohydrate a day, and still be in ketosis. And, we're going to get to this stage where we'll be able to monitor it like we can with continuous glucose monitors. Abbott, same company, are going to launch continuous ketone monitors so that we can see if we're in ketosis. And there's some other products like Lumen on the market now, which tell you if you're burning fat or carbohydrate. They're looking at it from a breath.
Yeah.
So those are kind of interesting. Listen,
I've used that. How accurate is that as a device?
I think in reality,
good.
We are most, unless we're fasted, like overnight, and then you'll be producing fat, we are mostly burning a mix of carbohydrate and fats for fuel. And that's why it becomes not very useful for in practically. But if you're fasting or if you're on a ketogenic diet, it's going to tell you that you are, because you're producing ketones in the breath. It's definitely not a panacea device. I am interested in the Abbott device that will look at your ketones. But, someone like me who's a former endurance athlete will burn through ketones very quickly. So my ketone level in the blood never goes very high because it can get in and be utilized very quickly. Whereas some people, it floats around in the blood because it needs to have the cofactors, going back to the mitochondria, to actually utilize it and to get it working. And so there's the keto diet, which I do recommend for people. I think we've got enough evidence to suggest that used intermittently, not as a lifestyle forever, because women especially get into a lot of problems with excessive keto, as you and I know through our own experience with clients, hormonal dysfunction, high cortisol, period problems, etc. But I think for some people, dipping in and out of a keto style diet sometimes is good, because it teaches the body metabolic flexibility, which is using a range of fuels for energy. And also a lot of companies, like you mentioned, Essence being one, Human, Professor Kieran Clark, they have all these ketone esters and also ketone-like products, which can increase ketone levels in the blood, and the ketone levels in the blood are what we call exogenous ketones. So they will give you ketones, a bit like Lucozade will give you glucose.
What's your view on the effectiveness of that? If they're actually going to work for you, to take that on board as being a drink that you consume, is that going to give you enough of a change in the way in which your body consumes energy? Or is it going to be just a short-lived thing for a moment of minutes or hours? How does it work?
Definitely. I've used all of these things, and I think ketone esters are game changing, and I know Essence are going to launch one of their own, because the problem with these drinks at the moment, they're super expensive. Each bottle is like 40 quid. And you might need one a day, and that's okay if you're a billionaire or a rock star, but not for the average person. But I have used them, and they are extraordinary. They reduce appetite, they decrease perception of effort, so you can do the same exercise for less. It feels less hard. You can keep going. So they are extraordinary for exercising people, or if you need a really clear brain. They kind of really do increase your blood ketone levels. So I think they're extraordinary products, and I think they've been shown to reduce inflammation, help with head injury, brain injury, and also potentially as disease-modifying agents because of their anti-inflammatory effects. So I think they will explode in the future. But again, expense and utility of use is not good at the moment.
Knowing what you know about being an athlete before in your triathlon days, and you were a high-level GB competing athlete, knowing what you know now compared to what you knew then about what you would eat and how to approach all of that, what you take as a supplement, if you were competing now, training now, using things like keto eating, for example, using keto products, would you have added those into parts of your training? Would you cycle those into your regime of programming your body? How would you have used that process? Not clearly, you can't do keto all the time when you're training very hard. It's not practical. It's not possible. Where would you have used it? How would you have used it before a competition? In competition time itself? Would it be a part of kind of 6 weeks out? How would you have built it in?
Good question. I would have definitely, and I have said this to people subsequently, I wish that ketone esters were available when I was competing, because I have subsequently used them with minimal training and still been able to run far faster than I would have, or I would have been expected to for the level of fitness I had. So that reduction in perception of effort would have been one. It's worth stating that you, like I said, because of the amount of fuel that you burn when you're endurance training, you do go into ketosis quite quickly. You can be in ketosis even with, 100 to 200 grams of carbohydrate a day. But I think, again, it's this concept of periodizing things, right? So I did make the mistake, as many women did, of eating not enough carbohydrate when I was an endurance athlete. And actually, carbohydrate is one of the biggest performance enhancing substances there is if used appropriately. But you do some, Team Sky brought this to the fore. You do some fasted training to increase, but low intensity, right? To increase that efficiency of fuel utilization. But then you feed and fuel some of the sessions that require more effort, for sure, in which you will be burning carbohydrate. So a hallmark of cardiovascular fitness and endurance training effect is your ability to burn fat to a higher heart rate. And to be able to do that, you do need to restrict carbohydrate in some sessions. So it's basically being able to work with your coach or whoever you choose to listen to say, well, I'm going to build in some fasted sessions. I'm going to build in some high intensity, well-fed sessions. And I'm going to make sure I recover and eat a lot on the days potentially that I'm, resting and recovering. So I restock my glycogen levels. But ketone esters, for sure, I would have been all over. Carnitine, Mo Farah made that quite famous. He was doing carnitine shots intravenously, but you can take it orally as acetylcarnitine, coenzyme Q10, all of these factors that improve. But, as we've also often come to, the importance of blood testing and seeing, this is my whole story, right? How I became and got interested in this field. I was like, why am I tired all the time? Why is she able to do more than me? So I started to look at blood tests more than your GP who goes, right, you're fine. And I looked at optimal ranges of ferritin, like iron and thyroid and sex hormones. And, that's a whole other conversation. But certainly being able to, and we talked about this before, periodize and personalize your approach based on your own biodata is important.
Entirely. If someone's listening to that as well, I'm thinking about using sort of fasted cardio as part of their process of maybe trying to lose weight or to change their body shape. What sort of level should someone be doing cardio for to try and achieve optimal fat loss, mitochondria shift to improve their fat efficiency? Because zone 2 training's become a bit of a go-to for mitochondrial shift. I think Peter Tier talks about that quite a lot as well, of trying to do 5-6 days a week, 45 minutes of zone 2, which for anyone listening is really fast-paced walking or super slow running. It's pretty low-grade stuff for long durations rather than going for high peaks and troughs or high intensity all the time. For those that maybe are either less insulin sensitive, so pre-diabetic potentially, or just are overweight and need to try and improve their ability to burn away fat, should they be going for more drawn-out, longer cardio, or is the push towards HIIT training appropriate? Because there's problems with high intensity training for the wrong person as well in producing even the inflammatory response of interleukins. So if you've got a localized hit of interleukin 6, is there a way in which that's becoming then too great for someone to then cope with? They can't then recover as quickly. Is that a problem? Is the after effect of the interleukin 10 to try and counter that enough with certain exercise? If someone's just starting a program or trying to improve their fat loss capability, where should they pitch it, and how much is too much, and where does resistance training fit into it as well? Because there's different ways you can use that to try and ensure we can obviously increase metabolism but not get too inflamed. It's confusing for anybody, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on your background and where you're starting from. I definitely think one can only benefit from fasted morning exercise of low intensity, and that can be for a lot of people just going for a walk or an hour, an hour's walk, taking some calls or being in nature or walking the dog. That will be for most people zone 2. And I'm not saying amble, but walk a bit. It could be a jog for some once you get used to it, 45 minutes of
So like a 6 out of 10 type feeling, somewhere there, that kind of mid-range stuff.
Not even that, like 5 out of 10 conversational. Yeah.
Less than that again.
Yeah, for sure. And then because that's going to build your fat burning capacity, right? So that would be, you can have a black coffee in that or green tea before you go out, which will help you tap into or lipolysis, breaking down your fat. And then I would make sure, because I know from my own experience and with many others, if you do HIIT training unfed, and I'm not talking about unfed just on one day, I'm talking about as an accruent over a week, right? you will get into problems, because things like being in the fed state when you do hit is going to quelch some of that interleukin response that you mentioned, because that's also related to adrenaline and cortisol. And if you're in the fasted state, you are relying on glucocorticoids, which are stress hormones, to kick the glucose into your system, which is not something you want to do consistently. So I think fed hit, fasted, low intensity. It's easier in the morning for many people because we have a natural rise in cortisol, and cortisol is our natural glucocorticoid. It will push glucose from the stores into the bloodstream to be utilized. So you've got that. And then also the strength training, again, I think it should be a fed activity for most people. It's different men to female, because I think men can get away with fasted weight training better, especially if they feed afterwards, especially with leucine, which stimulates growth hormone production. But it's a complex one, which is why, you've got to pick and choose who you listen to, right? And I guess this is one of the reasons you've put a podcast together. It's try to get credible science in front of people in an understandable, digestible manner. Because there's so much nonsense out there on Instagram and social media, and people are really getting into problems with it. And that's what I see in my practice, is the downsides.
Science is, it's developing at the rate it always does. It gets faster and faster and faster. And I think anyone in the industry, in the fitness and health industry, unless you take real attention and stay up to date, you are way behind the curve.
Yeah.
And the information on exactly how to try to make sure we can get the best out of a body is changing on a day-by-day basis. But I think certainly there's a trend line that's becoming a bit clearer, both on a longevity perspective, but from a performance perspective as well, on the fasting, use of fasting, timing of high-intensity resistance training for males, on creating human growth hormone response. And there's research that we were looking very strongly at about a year or two ago, which is about the use of specifically supersetting agonist-antagonist muscle groups at a high-intensity rep range of 4 to 6 reps post 16-hour starvation, so fasted state. And that seemed to produce a tripling of the human growth hormone response from doing specifically supersetting work. But that might just be for guys. You could be right, rather than being for females.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you have to look at the milieu. You have to look at the sort of view and what triggers you need to push at the right time, right? Because depending on what you want to achieve, whether it's fat loss and then muscle gain, I think you have to sort of, or you did this very well, you periodize, set goals within chunks throughout the year. You can't just aim for it all at once. And I do think a range of activities is a good idea as well.
What about stress alongside that? Stress clearly has a huge impact on the body. So you touched on cortisol just now. Someone who's in a very highly stressed state, and when you do a Dutch test and look at their cortisol levels through the day, explain what we're looking at within a Dutch test. We look at the cortisol breakdown specifically, and at what levels that's too high, dangerous, and when it is at a high elevated cortisol stress state, what someone really should and what they really should not be doing. Because clearly there's a risk to certain people at a high level activity with a high cortisol level. How do we break that down?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because even if we do the Dutch test, and some people, it could have been, how they were on that day, right? The next day they could have been in a particularly different state. But if people feel the same on that day as they normally feel as the sort of average, then it's usually reflective. I also tell people to do what they would normally do. So if they completely stop drinking coffee when they'd normally have 4, then the Dutch test isn't going to reflect their normal state of affairs. So I just think it's a bit ridiculous when they tell you to, as an instruction to do that. So yeah, I think for sure, we know if you are high cortisol, high metabolized cortisol, so if you're off the charts, your dials are that way on the Dutch, then, the focus of lifestyle and diet and exercise should be to move the dial the other way. And that is less intensity of exercise, more restorative exercise, more breath work, more yoga, more time in nature, more working on your relationships, your stress, etc. or your stress triggers, right? Otherwise, we know that over time, if you maintain those levels of cortisol, your risk of all-cause mortality is higher. Risk of immune suppression, cardiovascular disease, cancer, all of those things. So I think definitely a sort of personalized approach should be seen there. But I think it's often estimated how important doing more restorative exercise is, for sure.
And with that in mind as well, recovery work. So not just in the exercise itself, but how we do other things to try and ensure that we do have a calming mechanism in the body post-exercise, or just in general. Use of meditation, use of infrared sauna, use of anything else that actually gives us a chance of getting restorative activity into the body. So meditation should be part of people's day-to-day existence.
Well, I think learning to meditate is the hardest thing, right? Because people say, I can't meditate. And then I often encourage people into different types of meditative activity, which can be going for a walk. It can be, mindfully doing washing up. It can be flotation tank. It can be swimming. It can be just time off
breathing techniques and patterns.
Breathing techniques, Wim Hof, those kinds of things are really helpful in encouraging meditative experience, which is essentially when you get that sort of remember those old TVs where it all went and there was just static there.
Get to that state,
and you just long for that sometimes, that kind of like comfortably numb.
We'll come to psychedelia in a moment. Don't worry, come back to that in a second. But using techniques like box breathing as a simple technique for some people. So box breathing is used by Navy SEALs, and it's a way to have a very simple way of controlling your breathing, calming the body. Which is effective, isn't it?
It very much, but make it easy. I use the Calm app because I love it. So it's Calm because it's multifactorial. It's got many things on. Insight Timer is another one that's really good. But yeah, just simply in the day, if you just count in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, is a really effective way of getting the vagus nerve to activate and calm down our parasympathetic kicks in, and we actually feel much more in the restorative, reparative state. Yeah. And
the vagus nerve is this link between the gut and the brain.
It's one of them. Yeah.
It actually is one of them. Yeah, absolutely. So a pretty key way to ensure that the hormonal. Yeah, got you exactly perfect. With that in mind as well, so you are now looking also at the therapeutic impacts of hallucinogenic compounds.
Yes.
Explain in more detail which ones those are. So everything from LSD to what else is in there? Psilocybin?
Yeah, I mean, there's been an explosion of research, and I was attending some of the meetings with Robin Carhart-Harris, who went to the same medical school at me at King's originally. He's now in university. He's now at UCFF in America, where a lot of the research is accelerating, and it's got massive funding. I think what's exciting about some of the psychedelic research now is that they work in a very different way from normal antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications, which tend to sort of numb the brain, tend to constrict it. They're very much more about opening and connecting and rewiring the brain, because we get stuck in these thought patterns, these behavior patterns, etc., etc. And I think for some people that's very difficult to get out of. Years of therapy, you just go on this narrative again and again. And I think what psychedelics tend to do is, I think this analogy that I didn't use, but Michael Pollan did in his book, How to Change Your Mind, which was amazing, changed my mind. And it made me look at psychedelics more in depth. Is this snow globe, the idea of, you'd see one of these snow globes, those that you used to buy, for kids, and you can see it's nice and settled, and you shake it up, psychedelic, a macrodose of psychedelic, under a therapeutic setting. I'll come back to that. You shake all the snow up, and then it lands, and you can see fresh snow and fresh tracks. And I think that's what psychedelics do. You suddenly are given, a sense of connectedness, a sort of conscious connectedness to something bigger than ourselves, a so-called mystical experience. And through that, you definitely feel that you can go on a different path in life. And for many, that can be game-changing. And it can change the narrative you have about yourself and your relationships with others, which is a big cause of mental health problems.
How much of that, if you're someone who's hasn't tried any sort of form of hallucinogenic, there's bound to be a fear of trying it out because of the unknown. There's a fear of People will obviously hear about and know about, a bad trip and things going wrong. So which of these things are true, which are not? Should it be that everyone should be? There was a talk about a state in America at one point, or a county at least anyway, trying to do maybe a wide mass microdosing in population to ensure that everyone felt generally just better and more alert and aware. Didn't ever happen in the end. But where does the fear come from? How much is that real and justified? And how much should there be less fear about trying controlled hallucinogenics in the right way?
I think
people will have concerns.
I mean, setting is everything. I think that's what I think it was Tim Ferriss that explored that originally. But many of the people that are talking about this now is the context in which you take it, the set being the intention in which you go into these experiences with, the environment in which you do them, who you do it with, the follow-up, the integration of the experience is so important. So I think coming out to Ibiza and, sitting on a beach doing some ayahuasca with a group of people is not the kind of experience that I'm advocating. It's more, the studies are looking at very much a controlled setting where you're given you explore some psychological aspects of where you are now and where you like to be. And then you the next day you have the dose, mushrooms for whatever it is, but mostly mushrooms or MDMA. They're looking at for PTSD has come up. You're wearing an eye mask, so your sensory deprivation. You've got a specific playlist on, which is created to augment certain emotions, highlight certain emotions in the brain. You're then going on an inward journey, and that's what my experience was. It was like a hand going through my life, like showing me how I'd felt in certain situations that, quite honestly, I'd forgotten about. But my nervous system, my body, my existence hasn't, they're layered in there somewhere. And I think we often forget that because we are so busy doing that we forget how to be, and we forget that our being depends on our history, and our history is ingrained in ourselves. And I didn't used to think about this until you've experienced it. So I think going into it with that, and then having the ability to come out, go for a walk, talk to a therapist, I think a private experience is much more beneficial than doing it as part of a group, because, and please don't say that I'm wooing here, but I've seen it in many different occasions, that when you take psychedelics, you're very much more energetically open, and if you are a sensitive individual, you will take on the emotion of the person whoever's next to you. So I think be very aware that that might happen. So I think private psychedelic ceremonies or with one close person is the way forward. And then the integration being the communication you have with a counselor or psychotherapist, whoever you've identified to take that. Don't just throw it all in, go, wow, that was amazing, and then just go on to the next thing. It needs a process of really thinking about it.
Is there a clinical metric that shows the evidence of change, the adaptation? Is there something which is a measurable? Sorry, I'm such a sort of data nerd. Is there a number you can sort of measure it against, saying it achieves X difference? I guess it's hard to put a number onto it.
Yeah, and I think some of they're looking at there's various different scales that research uses in terms of whether depression scales or well-being scales, but I think it's a perception. It's if people have a self-rated wellness score, which is actually correlated remarkably closely to actually, if you do deep blood test screening of people, how well people feel, or their self-rated score on how well they are usually correlates with their with these scores. So we know that those scores improve. So it very much looks at people often described as just feeling lifted, lighter, and more connected to life.
Are there people that maybe shouldn't be trying it?
I think yes. If you've got any history of psychiatric illness, or if you're on any current medication, it's something that needs to be approached with caution. I think that's what companies. There's one in Amsterdam called Synthesis that have a clinical psychologist called Roz Watts, who's amazing, running their program. She came from Imperial. So I think doing these things well is super, super important. And of course, any medication will potentially interfere with the psychedelic component of the substance, especially Prozac.
Sure.
Things. And also, some people aren't prepared to go deep, to start digging through layers of things that they don't want to. And it might not be that that's what your experience shows you, but sometimes, it will bring up But as I mentioned very quickly, MDMA, and I do know people that the research with MDMA and PTSD is incredible. For actually just breaking through these trauma patterns and these horrible experiences.
But this is then delivered again on a more clinical basis, because the MDMA is being used
Absolutely.
as being a recreational drug.
Yeah, it's delivered intravenously, actually, in most places. And then ketamine as well is licensed for depression. And these are drugs that clearly are used as party drugs, but they're abused as party drugs. And therefore they come with a lot of side effects and interactions and all of these things. But a clinical setting where it's dose controlled, your hydration status, you've got a doctor there. The music is, potentially, it's all augmented to create an experience, and then you're supported afterwards. A very different experience than going clubbing on MDMA.
How would someone go about trying to find the way to get the right person to work with? That's going to be the next question most people have is, well, okay, that sounds great, but where do I go? What do I do? What's the next step to this?
There's MAPS, which is, I can't remember it's an acronym, MAPS, and Synthesis, which is the place in Amsterdam. The Third Wave gives out a lot of information on this. Tim Ferriss's podcast, USONA. It's another research organization that gives out material on where to go. I mean, there's licensed therapists in the US and some in the UK. The only one that's licensed for use in the UK at the moment is ketamine for treatment-resistant depression. But in other countries, psilocybin, and you can get on a clinical trial. And for some cases, I sent 10 of my patients into clinical trials at Imperial, and all of them had positive experience.
Amazing. Tamsin, we are out of time. It's been a pleasure as always, and good to see you looking, of course, very healthy and well and good. I know you had, we're going to do a whole other episode on this. You had long COVID. I know you and I spoke at the very start of that whole process where you got sick, and then, well, okay, you're going to get sick, get over it. And then it obviously got worse and spiraled. We're going to come back and do an episode on that too, I think, because there's so much there to talk about the long effects of what COVID's doing in everybody, in the young. It's very worth touching as well on things such as the use of vaccines and the short-term effect of potential myocardial inflammation on young people by taking the vaccine. Again, this should not be seen as being like a big risk factor, but we're discussing understanding what that actually is as well. So let's do that again. But you're healthy and well now for sure, aren't you?
Much better than I have been, but still not back at my pre-COVID self. But we evolve, don't we? We adapt and evolve and learn and share the story along the way.
We do, definitely. Well, you're looking great. Great to see you.
Thank you. Thanks
for your time. It's been great as ever, and we'll see you then very, very soon.
Nice to see you, Matt. Bye. Take care, everyone.